Hi, I'm Linda Mao, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Blanton Museum of Art, and our interviewer, Casey Schanbaum, speaks with curator Douglas Cushing about the exhibition Goya, Mad Reason. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're here with Douglas Cushing at Goya, Mad Reason at the Blanton Museum of Art. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I figured we'd just dive right in. There's so much to look at. There's a few different themes that are explored in this exhibition, and they're all Goya's experiences. So there's the art of bullfighting, there's war, there's famine, there's allegory, there's follies. What does that say about Goya's uniquely Spanish experience?
If anything, I would say it actually begins to unravel the idea of it being essentially Spanish. He certainly is a Spaniard. So for instance, with bullfighting, he was an aficionado from his younger days. There's some tell that he may have even fought bulls when he was younger a little bit. I don't know that that's actually true, but we certainly have letters with him and his best friend, Martin Zapatero, sort of bantering back and forth about who liked the best, bullfighters, which style was the best, and calling his friend Martin crazy for not liking the bullfighters he liked. So, there's a sense in which bullfighting is certainly Spanish, and he saw it as Spanish, but at the same time, from about the 1870s on, he was spending a lot of time with liberal elites, ilustrados, intellectuals who were interested in the Enlightenment ideas coming from France. And a lot of them actually did not like bullfighting. One friend of his, Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos, actually made the argument very specifically that it was absurd to call bullfighting essential to Spanish culture. That a few men brought up from birth to do this who would risk life and limb and often die in the ring, that represented Spanish culture, was just false. And so Goya is sort of in this world between these sets of ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, and I think really rethinking what it means to be Spanish. I think when the war happens, at first, a lot of the people around him were welcoming of the French, and even the lower classes were welcoming of the French because they thought that it would get rid of their king and prime minister, who they didn't particularly like. They felt the prime minister had impoverished the country, weakened the church, and they didn't like that, and also it cuckolded the king, and they did not approve of that. And they thought the king was just a terrible leader. So at first, both the enlightened figures and around Goya in the salons and court and the populace really welcomed the French, but then as Napoleon's liberation of Spain from the rule of the Bourbons became an occupation of Spain, there was a fracturing and a dividing where the majority of the Spanish regular culture rejected the French, rejected everything that was about Frenchness. And this was in a way a return to an earlier idea where the populace, the large populace, not particularly well educated and very distrustful of foreigners and foreign ideas. And then they thought that the sort of French-leaning intellectuals that Goya was hanging out with were effeminate and very non-Spanish. And so as we look through the Tauromachia, as we look through the war where we see the fracturing of the society around Goya, I think we see Goya's place between these two cultures, between up high and low culture, and between outward-looking Spain of a possible future and inward-looking Spain that sort of happened continually. Really from that point, I would say up through Franco, there was a lot of inward looking. And there's a famous Spanish philosopher, Jose Ortega y Gasset, who argued that in order to understand Spain's history since about 1650, you ultimately needed to understand the bullfight, because the rejection of sort of criticisms of bullfighting from outside of Spain, from the French especially, their response to that criticism was always to turn inward, to reject everything from outside.
Well, and I found it interesting that one of the bullfighting plates has the bullfighting against dogs, and it mentions that Goya was a hunter and he had his own dogs. So it kind of takes that, and it leads perfectly into the war series. So touching on that, how do you think that the themes of the art of bullfighting, how do they compare to that of the war, and how do they add to that dialogue?
So this series on bullfighting he actually made just after the war, in 1815, 1816. The majority of the Disasters of War series was done between 1810 and probably about 1815. And so I think what we see in this series is Goya reconsidering bullfighting. The dogs being loosed on the bull, here not maybe suggesting that bullfighting is not in its golden age anymore, that it's devolved into an empty spectacle of brutality. And I think that happens more in the series as we move towards the end of it. So the first half of the series is interesting in that, it shows that Goya was trying to sell this series. He wanted to make money off of it. And he was being questioned by the new government, the government of Ferdinand VII, as to his loyalties during the war, because he had done some painting for the Bonaparte court. And so he comes out of the war under scrutiny, and he makes a series that's about bullfighting, which is very, in a way, patriotic and nationalistic, and he thinks there's a market for it. And so the first half of this series is this history of bullfighting that makes an argument that bullfighting has always been on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, since prehistoric man, through the Moorish conquest, the Reconquista, all the way up to the present day for him. And then the second half of the series is all bullfighters in his lifetime and maneuvers that they were famous for. And as you get towards the end of the series, it stops being about just all maneuvers or bullfighters all of a sudden, and you have one print where everything breaks down, and no longer is it about that sort of unified subject of one torero, one suerte or maneuver. It's all about the breakdown of order within the ring, this sort of brutality gone wild within it.
So in the next series, where we're talking about the disasters of war, it kind of crescendos as you're going through it, to where the first print or the first plate is a singular man, and then it starts to get more and more chaotic. What do you think Goya was trying to say about the state of war, of humanity, of his country? And also the titles of these prints are very direct. I mean, it's Don't Look at This, or The Harsh Reality. I think there's one there like Wild Beasts. So he wasn't shy about his representation of war.
No, and on top of the sort of terseness of those titles is a gallows humor that runs throughout, which I think is one of his ways of dealing with the trauma of war. As you're pointing out, there's this breakdown of order. So from the very outset of the series, you'll see like a unified singular figure, a composition based around that. And then you'll see these binary oppositions with a group of people fighting another group of people. And then you'll see these clusters of figures that no longer have that sort of unity. And I think throughout that, he's using his compositions to tell us something about the breakdown of society itself during the war. The war is ultimately the end of civil living for a people, and having come through the Enlightenment with its values of reason and justice and individual liberty, tolerance, all these things that were held up especially by the French, that made their way in a limited fashion into Spain, but were certainly known in Goya's circles. I think he's seeing the end of the Enlightenment under Napoleon, ironically coming from the French, and destroying his society, debasing the French, debasing the Spanish, and he doesn't lay the blame at just the feet of the French. I mean, despite his own title for the series, Spain's Bloody War against Napoleon, paraphrase, despite that, he points out that his own people are often turning on one another, and the sort of mob mentality that arises in war. And so it's, he's pointing out how complicit the Spanish people are, the guerrilla fighters, the Spanish army, the British army, and the French, obviously, throughout it.
Well, and that being said, he probably could not have gotten away with having that harsh of a critique of war, of, casting blame on both sides as a court painter. And I know we had talked earlier about some of the prints even having references to Renaissance work, neoclassical imagery. So can you, I guess, delve into a little bit of that and how he could get away with using such imagery and such harsh critiques?
Well, I mean, in part, it's by not publishing it. It seems like he meant to publish it. The fact that he numbered the sequence not once, but twice, went back and resequenced again, suggests he had every intent of publishing the series. But the way the politics in Spain were, shifting from Bourbon rule to Bonaparte rule to back to Bourbon rule, there was never a good point where he could actually safely publish this. And around the time he started making this series, he probably actually had a French soldier billeted with him in his home. So he's like leaving home and going and making these prints and returning home to French soldiers right there. But yes, he's able to imbue them not just with the sort of objective eyewitness approach, which is certainly there in the series, but he's able to have this poetic additional undercurrent that runs through. So for me, one that is particularly strong is his image to the cemetery from the Famine series in the center of the disasters, in which it's these men carrying somebody who's just died, bringing him to the cemetery, but the pose is taken not directly from one image, but sort of an aggregate of a lot of images of the deposition of Christ.
Yeah, it looks like Rubens' Entombment of Christ, actually. It's very similar.
Much, yeah, and he would have known Rubens through Rubens' visit to Spain, actually, during Velázquez's time as court painter. So yeah, I mean, he's essentially elevating the suffering of the individual anonymous man in Spain to that of the suffering of Christ, sort of equating those things.
It's a very enlightened perspective to give these people a little bit more dignity than maybe they were dealt at the time.
But also very romantic to say, it's not just about the objective sort of representation of what's happening. It's also about this, what does it feel like to be there? What is that subjective experience? And I think, for me, that's what makes Goya so great, is that tension between the Goya of the Enlightenment and the Goya that is heading into the Romantic movement, and how torn he is ultimately between those two things, even though he doesn't know there's a Romantic movement coming up because it's in the future.
Well, and that brings me to kind of the more allegorical part of this Devastations of War series, where, once you get through the war series, the famine series, there's so much imagery to look at, and it really is brutal. It's hard to take in. And so you get to this kind of allegorical series where you can see that he's being more critical of his government, the state of humanity, and you kind of agree with him, like you're working out these frustrations and exhaustion that you've just had in looking at all these prints. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and also the inclusion of Will She Rise Again, which is one of the plates that seems to be a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah, so as we're describing, the first part is the atrocities, the second part, the famine, and the third part, these emphatic caprices. What's interesting about what's happening at this point is at about 1810, the Spanish self-rule was actually limited to a very small area in the south, in Cadiz. And in that city, they actually got a parliament together to decide what kind of government they wanted once they were able to oust the French. And they argued back and forth, and they eventually actually wrote a constitution called now the Constitution of 1812, and it was a calling for a constitutional monarchy. So it had a ruler, had a king, queen, but at the same time, sovereignty resided within the people. There was a free press, there was political tolerance, and due process in the justice system. And at this point, there was a lot of hope and a lot of sort of argumentation back and forth about what the future would hold. at the end of the war, Napoleon sort of lost a war of attrition at this point, and he's forced to give up. He releases Ferdinand VII, who is the Bourbon ruler, rightful ruler, who sort of half-heartedly agrees to abide by this constitution as he's re-entering Spain, as he's released. By the time he reaches Valencia, he calls that constitution null and void, and he sends his people out to arrest all the drafters of the constitution. So these emphatic caprices are sort of Goya dealing with the change up to the point that Ferdinand comes back in, the sort of back and forth about what the future of Spain will hold, and then the repression that actually follows. And yet, at the end of that, there's two objects you mentioned. One of them, there's Truth is Dead, where truth is embodied as this woman, this radiant woman, whose light sort of comes out and overwhelms all the people who, were instrumental in killing her. And then the last one, Will She Rise Again? Again, that light overwhelms all these masses of aristocrats and church figures that really don't want to see truth there, but it's his hope at the end of it. And I think that that's something that Goya carried with him throughout his whole life, is that hope. No matter what he lived through, and he lives through pretty traumatic times, he always had this hope, always, always, always. And he was eventually, he would leave Spain, 1824. He would get permission first and say he was going to Bordeaux, France for health reasons, and they got permission to stay longer, but really the reason was he was getting away from Madrid and the court and the danger politically for him there. But there's this fascinating story. So he reaches Bordeaux, and there's this younger writer, Leandro Moratin, who is there when he arrives in Bordeaux. And he describes Goya, who at that point is in his upper 70s, old man. He says, he arrived, he's weak and he's tired and old, and he speaks not a word of French, and he didn't bring a maid, and if anyone needs it, it's him. But he was so happy and desirous of seeing the world. And so, he's a man who just wants to experience life, wants to experiment in his artwork, wants to believe in progress in the future through everything he's been through. So I think there's something just really powerful in that.
Well, and I think that that's evident in the final series, which is the Follies, as far as progress and experimentation. It seems like the works within that sequence are a lot more experimental. There's definitely some surrealist elements to some of them, where the hillsides look like they have certain facial features to them, or there's some spatial uncertainty. So it kind of caves into that irrationality. So how does that, I guess, tie an end or tie a bow onto this exhibit? Like, what does that say about the exhibit as a whole?
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you pick up on the sort of surrealist aspect of it. André Breton, who is one of the leaders of surrealism, one of the creators of surrealism, actually said that Goya was already surrealist in his day. And what he means by that is Goya was sort of plumbing the unconscious and the irrational at this very early date, allowing sort of what comes out of it to come forth on the page. For me, the series is where Goya gets his most romantic, in a sense. If the Enlightenment focused on rationalism and objectivity as a way to bring humankind forward, the Enlightenment, or the Romantic movement, still believed in progress, but thought that the rational as well as the aesthetic was important if we were going to really become our fullest selves. And so I think what Goya's doing through that series, and these objects that don't have necessarily right answers to what they mean, he's actually exploring the limits of our reason. To know ourselves better, to know how we think by knowing the limits of how we can think. And by that I mean, if we think in terms of almost a linguistic kind of structure, there's something beyond that that's just pure feeling, that's pure rational experience. And I think he's exploring that other side in order to know the whole better. And for me, that's what brings it all together is, Goya is living between these worlds, between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, and living in that tension between objectivity and subjectivity. And I would argue personally that we've never left that moment, that we're still trying to find, really to navigate between these two worlds, because we want the best of our reason and rationalism, but we want the creativity and imagination that comes with the other. And so we split these things apart in the Enlightenment, and we haven't put them back together, and we're trying to figure out how to make them both work together. And so that's why I think Goya's exploration speaks to us, because we're still going through that. I think Surrealism was another Romanticism in that way, and I think we're still trying to come to terms with this new way of thinking that is really the modern thought after the Enlightenment.
Well, and I think that is what gives this exhibit such a modern sensibility, is that, even though these were very of Goya's time, almost a photographic experience, there's modern sensibilities to all of them. I mean, the gruesome acts of war, of bullfighting, and, a cultural pride, and going through a trauma and how you rationalize or don't. Mm-hmm. So it's a gorgeous exhibit, and I highly recommend seeing it. So thank you so much for sitting down with us again.
Thank you.
We want to thank Douglas for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to blantonmuseum.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.